And I'm going to talk to you on the evidence-based approach to the management of proliferative diabetic retinopathy. And I am Wai Chin Lam. I'm from the University of Hong Kong, but 6 months before I was in Toronto, so I just moved to Hong Kong just recently. And I think for this group, it's probably not a surprise that diabetic retinopathy is a leading cause of blindness in the working age adults. And about 60% of patients with type 2 diabetes, and almost all the patients with type 1 diabetes will develop diabetic retinopathy during the first 20 years of diseases. So in fact, quite often diabetic retinopathy was already developed before they were being seen or diagnosed. And as you can see here, the most common causes for the visual losses in this aspect of diabetic retinopathy is proliferative diabetic retinopathy and diabetic macular edema, which account for about 11.72% of the visual threatening diabetic retinopathy. The prevalence of diabetic retinopathy is quite high. You can see among about a third of the patients with diabetes. With this prevalence, we know that by year 2010, there will be 17.2 million proliferative diabetic retinopathy in the world populations. For most of this morning and some yesterday, we've been talking mostly on the non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy. And in patients who have severe or very severe non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy, they can progress to, about 50% of them will progress to proliferative diabetic retinopathy in 1 year. And what's also important is that about a quarter of those patients with proliferative diabetic retinopathy I'll rephrase it, about 25% of patients with diabetes for 15 years will develop proliferative diabetic retinopathy. And the complication related to the proliferative diabetic retinopathy is usually related to the neovascularization that was present, and they're either in the forms of hemorrhage, fibrosis like this picture shown here, neovascular glaucoma, and sometimes tractional retinal detachment and vitreous detachment. And for those complications, can lead to irreversible loss of visions. So I'm going to share with you the Canadian Ophthalmological Society. We, in 2012, worked on a evidence-based clinical practice guideline for the management of diabetic retinopathy. So a group of us basically goes through the literature to try to look at the different publications that is available at that time and try to determine what are the evidence-based approach for management of diabetic retinopathy. So for the treatment of proliferative diabetic retinopathy in daily practice, laser photocoagulation has been the standard of care for proliferative diabetic retinopathy over the last 20 to 30 years. The benefit of the laser or pan-retinal laser photocoagulation is that it can cause regressions of the neovascularizations. When the proliferative diabetic retinopathy regresses within the first 3 months after the PRP laser, the visual prognosis is usually quite good. You can see about 50 to 60% reductions of the risk of severe visual losses. Of course, there's also side effects or complications related to the treatment. We all know that it can cause decreased vision and particularly loss of visual field from the laser treatment. And if you do a lot of laser at one setting, it can cause macular edema. And most patients require more than one treatment to control their proliferative changes. And And some patients, even with treatment, they will still end up needing vitrectomy. The diabetic retinopathy study has identified those patients who are at risk to develop proliferative diabetic retinopathy. And so for those patients who develop these high-risk characteristics are the ones who will benefit from the laser treatment. So the question is, what is high-risk characteristics? Like, how do we identify these patients? So this is the diabetic retinopathy study definition for high-risk characteristics. Any 3 out of the 4 will constitute high risk. The presence of neovascularizations, or NVD, when the neovascularization is on the disc. The third one is if the neovascularization is large. What do you mean by large? If it's more than a quarter of this area on the disc, or half of this area elsewhere. Or if you have hemorrhage, preretinal or vitreous hemorrhage. So a picture like this, with neovascularizations on the disc, will fulfill number 1 and number 2. And if the neovascularization is more than a quarter of this area, that will be 3. So this picture actually shows a typical high-risk patients who will develop proliferative diabetic retinopathy and who will benefit from laser treatment that will improve the proliferations and reduce the risk of visual losses. So in this study, and as mentioned earlier in the ETDRS study, when they looked at the laser treatment, they saw that the benefit of proliferative diabetic retinopathy, treating those patients with the high-risk characteristics, that benefit is not only there, it lasts for 6 years. That will reduce the risk from 37% in the control group, which does not receive laser, to this 70% in the treated group for developing severe visual losses. What's also interesting is that those patients who didn't have the severe or the advanced form of proliferative diabetic retinopathy, meaning that they don't have all the 3 out of the 4 characteristics, PRP still have some benefit, and they still can reduce the progressions of the high-risk characteristics by 50%. So the treatment with laser is unquestionably beneficial for proliferative diabetic retinopathy, whether in the milder form to prevent them from progressing, or in the severe form from preventing them from loss of visions. There are some negative effects of the treatment. It can, as I mentioned, cause progression of diabetic macular edema. And it can cause vitreous hemorrhage. Particularly, it can increase tractions in the resulting traction retinal detachment and loss of light visions related to doing the large amount of the peripheral field. Because when you do laser, you damage the retina, and you also damage a lot of the rod cells which are responsible for the light visions, especially if you do a very large amount of treatment. And of course, for that reason, you also reduce the visual field. Fortunately, despite this, most of these side effects are not sufficient enough to cause patients to fail the driving test, because they still manage to maintain their visions for the purpose of driving. So here is an example of a case that I thought would be useful for discussions. So a 54-year-old gentleman presented with flashes and floater. He has type 2 diabetes and hypertension for 15 years on insulin. His visual acuity is 20/70 in the right eye and 20/40, and the eye is relatively normal on examinations. It's a little dark here, so this is a pictures of the fundus, and I guess it turned out to be a little darker than it should be. So you can see some exudations, and the color photograph with this wide field photo show mostly just exudate and some hemorrhages. In fact, it was difficult to see the neovascularizations that was there. And this is a closer view. Again, you just see mostly hemorrhages and some exudate. But the fluorescein angiogram are much more telling. And you can see some early hyperfluorescence here along the arcade. And in the mid-transit, you can see the leakage from the neovascularizations of the retina. And there are some curious laser burns here. And you can see the progressive increase of leakage and the area of capillary non-diffusion adjacent to it. And you can see the leaking microaneurysms around the macula, and you can imagine them probably some macular edema. And in the left eye, something similar. You get this large area of neovascularizations with leaking and microaneurysms here, and area of capillary non-diffusion and leakage along the vascular trunk. The leakage in the left eye is not as diffuse as that seen in the right eye. So OCT confirmed the presence of central involved macular edema. And in the right eye, in the left eye, despite the leaking microaneurysms that's seen on the fluorescein angiogram, there's no significant degree of retinal edema seen on OCT. So basically, we have a patient with proliferative diabetic retinopathy with also clinically significant diabetic macular edema in the right eye. So in these situations, the recommended treatment, when you have proliferative diabetic retinopathy with centrally involved macular edema, you will be using anti-VEGF, intraocular anti-VEGF treatment should be considered at the time when you were doing PRP. But remember, this recommendation was done at 2012. That was before the publications of the protocol S. But what's interesting, though, is that in addition to the benefit of using anti-VEGF for the treatment of the diabetic macular edema, we also seen that the anti-VEGF reduces the risk of diabetic retinopathy progressions. Here is the pooled data of RISE and RIDE. Those are two studies looking at using ranibizumab to treat diabetic macular edema compared to sham. And you can see that the percentage of participants with diabetic progressions by either 2 or 3 steps was significantly reduced in the ranibizumab treated group compared to the sham group. So not only the fact that the macular edema was improved in the study, which was aimed for that purpose, but coincidentally, the anti-VEGF also make the diabetes less severe. Here's also another study looking at the visual acuity change from baseline for a short-term treatment when the patient received both anti-VEGF and focal macular laser treatment with PRP. What they found is that in patients who received the ranibizumab, 2 injections in that 3 months period, or 1 injection of triamcinolone, those patients who, in addition to receiving the macular for macular edema and PRP for the proliferative changes, has a better visual acuity than those who were just treated with laser alone. So the anti-VEGF and the steroid actually has additional benefit to the visions in the setting with proliferative diabetic retinopathy and diabetic macular edema. So the question then raised is that when you have a proliferative diabetic retinopathy, so is anti-VEGF better or as good as PRP? So this is the basis for the RCRNet Protocol S study. And they basically have the question is, they want to look at the comparisons of PRP versus intravitreal ranibizumab for 0.5 milligram for the treatment of proliferative diabetic retinopathy. So the patients randomized to either getting the ranibizumab intravitreal injections, or PRP. And they want to see if the injection is non-inferior to the PRP treatment over 3 years of period. And this is the treatment protocol. The patient will get 4 loading doses of 0.5 milligrams of ranibizumab, and then following that with PRN injections. On the other hand, patient will get a PRP laser, and they will follow every 3 months for that. And what happened is that if the patient develops macular edema after the initial treatment, whether it will be laser, the patient can also receive ranibizumab. So this is the result of the visual acuity from baseline. You can see that the orange line is those received ranibizumab, and the solid white line is those received on PRP. And there is a benefit of about 2-letter gain, or 2-letter difference between ranibizumab compared to PRP. So there is a significant gain in the vision from baseline to year 2 with the treatments of the anti-VEGF compared to laser. So the anti-VEGF actually have some benefit. What about those patients already have diabetic macular edema at baseline? So normally we will have put them on intravitreal anti-VEGF treatment, and the benefit even more noticeable. 7.9 versus 1.9 letter gain in year 2 in the ranibizumab group compared to the laser group. For those who did not have diabetes, diabetic macular edema at baseline, the improvement of the visions, or the difference of the vision between the ranibizumab group and the laser group are not as high, but still in the ranibizumab group, in the intravitreal anti-VEGF group, they do have better visions than those who only receive laser, even though they don't have macular edema as a confounders in the need to use anti-VEGF. So the conclusion of the study basically confirmed or showed that the treatment with the 0.5 ranibizumab group were not inferior to the laser treatment for visual outcome at year 2. And what's also important is that, in fact, the ranibizumab group will have better, greater visual improvement than the laser group. And in the group that receive ranibizumab, they often does not require laser, meaning that their proliferative diabetic retinopathy actually improve with the injections. And as it mentioned, in fact, about half the patients were shown to have improved their diabetic progressions, and they become less severe in the group that received anti-VEGF ranibizumab. That is understood because the anti-VEGF will make the proliferations less because it suppresses the VEGF, which is the main driver for the proliferative changes. The probability of developing central diabetic macular edema with visual losses at year 2 was also higher in the PRP group when compared to ranibizumab group. So overall, it suggested that the protocol has shown that the anti-VEGF treatment is in fact better than the PRP group for the treatments of proliferative diabetic retinopathy. Whether there is concomitant diabetic macular edema doesn't seem to matter because it is still more favorable to consider use of ranibizumab compared to laser, because in both situations, whether the macular edema is there or not, the treatment with the ranibizumab helps to get a better vision outcome, and by modulating and making the severity of the diabetic retinopathy less. So the overall observation is that there is a distinct advantage of ranibizumab, that less visual losses, especially visual field losses, because in PRP cases, you do wipe out the peripheral field by ablating that part of the retina. And with the treatments of the ranibizumab, there's less frequent occurrence of diabetic macular edema. And because there's less progressions of the proliferative changes, there's less need to have vitrectomy. And for those who are being treated for diabetic macular edema, they already get the treatment. Of course, though, for the PRP, it is less costly than the ranibizumab, and there's no risk of endophthalmitis related to the intravitreal injections, and you don't have that systemic risk factor related to the anti-VEGF, especially in the group of patients with diabetes who may have a higher cardiovascular risk related to their diabetes. And most of the patients were able to, less than half the patients require additional PRP, so most of the patients were able to complete the treatment in 1 or 2 sessions. And so there is still some kind of benefit between the PRP and the anti-VEGF. The important kind of understanding of the protocol S is that when they include those patients for the study, those patients are patients who are considered that are able to be treated with laser alone. So that means the severity of the proliferative diabetic retinopathy are not as advanced. Okay, so I think you need to look at the protocol as in that way. It's not suggesting that for all proliferative diabetic retinopathy patients coming in, you should be giving them anti-VEGF. Besides, it's quite costly, and not only that, they require frequent injections, and we probably require more frequent observations. For those who have very advanced proliferative diabetic retinopathy, then laser and surgery possibly may need to be considered. And we'll come to that later on when we look at some other examples. But what is also important is that with the use of the anti-VEGF, such as ranibizumab, it shown that it actually improved or reduced the progressions of the diabetic retinopathy that was seen in protocol I, when the ranibizumab combined with laser and in treatment with diabetic macular edema. And when they look at those patients who was receiving the anti-VEGF, they found that there is actually reductions in the diabetic retinopathy progressions. And that was seen in the RISE and RISE study as well in the protocol S. So it is consistently seen that the use of anti-VEGF will help. Of course, it will help to reduce the progressions of diabetic retinopathy at the cost of repeated injections. And we have seen also that when we stop the treatment, there is a likelihood some of the proliferative changes will return. What about the indication for vitrectomy? So when the proliferative changes become more advanced, when there are more severe complications that occur despite treatment, or when the patient presents quite late, and the indication for consideration of vitrectomies are non-clearing vitreous damage, attractions on the macula creating distortions of the macula, or actually detachment of the macula itself, or you can have a combined tractional and torsional macular detachment that can progress, and you have a dense macular hemorrhages. In those patients who have active proliferative diabetic retinopathy, who require vitrectomy, there may be considerations or the need to treat them to reduce the intraoperative hemorrhages and also making the the postoperative recovery better when the vitrectomy is being considered. And that has been seen in numbers of case report and study that was done using, particularly in the in cases using Lucentis or bevacizumab as the agents to treat. Other situations that may benefit from vitrectomy, such as gold cell glaucoma, and I mentioned some of the other conditions, such as progressive fibroblastic proliferations, and mainly if the macula is being threatened, even though at the time it may not be involved. Here's a little bit of a busy slide looking at the management approach for proliferative diabetic retinopathy. And I mentioned if the patient presented with high-risk characteristics, there is reason to treat because the study has shown the benefit for the treatment. But in some instances, it may still be the considerations to start treatment before they develop high-risk characteristics, particularly if the patient lives far away, have difficulty coming to the clinic, that you want to get them treated early so that they won't come back with a very advanced disease with hemorrhages and traction retinal detachment. Or if you find that the patient have a very quick progression, meaning that the disease itself is going to get worse, and you don't have to need to wait till the progression becomes severe to intervene. And the questioning compliance, the patients may not be coming back on a regular basis. And so those probably will be cases that you want to start laser treatment even before they develop the high-risk characteristics. Of course, those who have the high-risk characteristics, they should be treated early with PRP. If they are having central macular edema, the treatment will be with anti-VEGF plus PRP. But with the current information from the protocol as those patients who doesn't have central macular edema, there's also benefit to treat with anti-VEGF that will help to modulate the severity of the diabetic retinopathy. The problem with that is that it is an extra cost and extra time that you need to be treating the patients, because for laser treatment, you can see them between 2 to 3 months up to 4 months. But for the treatment, when you use anti-VEGF, that means you have to see them more frequently. So that may not be as feasible in a very busy or in places where resources is limited. After the treatment, if you still see progression of the active vessels, then you will require more treatment, as shown in less than half of the patients who were treated with PRP for proliferative diabetic retinopathy. But if there is continued progression with maximum pan-retinal laser photocoagulation, there's probably no benefit to add more laser, because the additional laser will cause more visual losses and potentially cause more decrease in the vision itself. So in those situations, sometimes vitrectomy may be considered. In those situations, maybe also using the anti-VEGF may be of benefit. Of course, in this situation where hemorrhages is there, and you can now consider using anti-VEGF. And if the vitreous hemorrhage is clear, then you can add PRP to stabilize the proliferative changes. If the vitreous hemorrhage doesn't clear, then you move on to do vitrectomy to clear the vitreous hemorrhage and allow you to add more laser either intraoperatively and postoperatively. it is important when there is traction occur during the preoperative assessment, when that is the indication to treat, is that if you decided to inject anti-VEGF, you need to have a very close observations to those patients, because in patients who already have tractions, the addition and with active proliferative changes, the injections of anti-VEGF can cause fibrosis and progressions of the traction retinal detachment. In those instances, it will actually can make the tractional retinal detachment worse. So you should consider injecting the anti-VEGF and seeing or planning the surgery within the week, but not a month later, because a month later, the traction can be much worse, and you could change a macular-threatening retinal detachment to a macular-involved retinal detachment, from a localized retinal detachment to a total retinal detachment. In some instances, you might want to also consider injecting the anti-VEGF postoperatively to reduce the hemorrhages or proliferations following the surgery. So it's important to make sure that if you decided to inject preoperatively, the fibrosis is limited and not leaving for a long interval between surgery and injections. This we have discussed briefly about what about treatment and diagnosis of retinopathy during pregnancy. So it's important that women who have diabetes should undergo proper eye examinations before they decided to have babies. And during the time when they were confirmed to have been pregnant, they need assessment during the subsequent first, second, and third trimester, because we all know that the diabetic retinopathy progressed more during the time of pregnancy. And in a situation when you have proliferative diabetic retinopathy, we have discussed in the last sessions that anti-VEGF is probably not a good idea because of the potential risk to the developing fetus. And PRP can be done during the time of pregnancy. In the case when you have clinically significant diabetic macular edema, instead of using anti-VEGF, you can consider using steroid if it's appropriate, and focal laser or grid laser, as that was being described very well by Dr. Newland early on. For the monitoring and assessments of the diabetes, particularly grading of diabetic retinopathy, the wide field imaging of wide field angiography has actually now provided an opportunity to improve the diagnosis. You can see in these pictures here that the standard 7 field that we normally see would not have picked up any of the proliferative changes on the pictures. But in the wide field, we can see the large area of neovascularizations and non-diffusions. So the wide field angiography these days provide another opportunity to pick up peripheral pathology and allow you to grade the retinopathy properly. Other publications have supported these observations that the wide field angiography can help to see the peripheral neovascularizations, the peripheral non-ischemia that might be responsible for the upregulations, increase of VEGF, that may be responsible for some of the diabetic macular edema that we see. And in those instances, treatment or laser treatment to the peripheral retina may also help to reduce the macular edema in those cases. And what's interesting is Loy et al. Recently published these observations of looking at the peripheral lesions that were seen on the wide-field angiography and identifying this, they describe them as predominant peripheral lesions, which I'm going to show you in a second. And they say if you see the presence of these peripheral lesions, which is retinal hemorrhages, and nothing in the posterior pole, it's still a significant indicator that will identify increased risk of progressions of diabetic retinopathy and the risk of progressing into proliferative changes. And what are those changes that we described? They were little retinal hemorrhages in the periphery, and only in the periphery. You're not picking them up in the posterior pole as you would expect to see in the more severe forms of diabetic retinopathy. And also here in the area of peripheral kind of vessels with anastomosis and non-diffusions. If you see those in the wide-field angiography, they are predictive of progressions of proliferative diabetic retinopathy. So they were able to kind of look at the extent of the non-diffuse peripheral retina and found that it is very highly correlated with the severity of the diabetic retinopathy and the presence of the predominantly peripheral lesions, namely retinal hemorrhages in the periphery and the area of non-diffuse in the periphery. So I'm going to finish off by presenting you a case. A 47-year-old woman referred to the emergency department for episodes of painless loss of vision in one eye over 24 hours. And she described having flashes for about 3 days and seeing big block of black spot blocking the visions. She is a type 2 diabetes on insulin and metformin, and very poorly controlled. You see the blood sugar that was done in the emergency room was for 20. And she did not have proper follow-up, and she basically presented the first time now for the eye examinations. And the vision in the right eye is quite poor. The left eye is reasonable. And here's the pictures. You can see that is very active proliferative retinopathy with pre-retinal hemorrhages, which is equivalent of vitreous hemorrhage and retinal hemorrhages. And you can see there was neovascularization at the disc. In addition to that, there's traction that's developed nasally. And left eye pictures blur with pre-retinal hemorrhages and this T macular hemorrhages, which account for the very poor visions in that eye. And fluorescein angiogram confirmed not only the presence of the MED, the neovascularization at the disc, and also the multiple neovascularization elsewhere and the hemorrhages. You can see that neovascularizations there. And the late phase of the angiogram of the neovascularizations. And in the left eye similarly. The OCT showed the irregular retinal surface from some of the fibrosis, but no macular edema, but tractions. So in this case, it's not what we were discussing for the total cortex. This is the case that we're going to need to intervene with surgery, laser, and anti-VEGF can be used, but not as the only treatment that you see in protocol S. Remember though, this patient did not have proper follow-up and proper monitoring. So not to forget, and I'm sure everybody understands the necessity to have a systemic control and good control their diabetes and blood pressure and their lipid level, the cholesterol level, and that is well supported by the DCCT and UKBDS studies. And so in this patient, she will need prompt pan-retinolysis for glucoablation to both arms, because that will help to reduce the proliferative changes to stabilize the visions. And she will also need early vitrectomy, especially for the left eye where there is hemorrhages and premacular hemorrhages. And when the vitreous hemorrhage doesn't clear, as this case were, there is the potential for progressions. And that's the reason why that in type 1 diabetic patients, we need to do early vitrectomy, because in type 1 diabetic patients, they tend to have much more aggressive proliferations of their diabetic retinopathy. And if you don't do vitrectomy to clear the vitreous hemorrhage early, then underneath the blood, there will be progressions of the tractions, and from extramacular involvement, we can develop macular involvement tractions and causing significant visual losses. The use of anti-VEGF, of course, it will be of benefit, but in the presence of tractional retinal detachment, it's very important that you understand this actually can cause more fibrosis and worsening of the tractional retinal detachment. And so if one is decided to use this, then you need to be able to see the patient within a week of the planned surgery, because by leaving them for a long period of time, meaning that if you leave them for a month, they could have much severe traction developed, and the visual outcome may not be as good. If anti-VEGF is used, it requires multiple injections. It also requires close monitoring. And I'll just say that one more time is that the indication for the use of anti-VEGF, especially in protocol S, is for less severe proliferative diabetic retinopathy. It's not in the same picture as we see. For the severe diabetic retinopathy with vitreous hemorrhage and tractions, they follow our traditional thinking that's been for the last 10, 15 years of early vitrectomy and prompt pan-retinal laser photocoagulations. So even though the anti-VEGF itself can help to modulate the progressions of the diabetic retinopathy, its benefit is limited in the more advanced forms of proliferative diabetic retinopathy. And if one is going to use it, there is the commitment to keep using it. So I think the majority of our patients, we're probably going to end up needing to use combinations of laser and anti-VEGF, despite the descriptions of or the outcomes of the protocol S. So I don't think protocol S has now kind of shift our management to use anti-VEGF alone, and that I don't think that will necessarily work. In fact, I don't think it will work for most of us, and just that it will help us to manage those patients who has mild to moderate proliferative diabetic retinopathy, especially those with concomitant diabetic macular edema. So I will stop here, and we can open up for questions.
I would like to ask if you have case with PDR with vitreous hemorrhage, maybe about case with 3 or 4, and how do you manage? Do you wait for about 1 month for surgery, or you use the anti-VEGF and follow up, and then maybe you can not you could postpone the surgery if it's getting there?
Very good question. So basically, you have a patient with vitreous hemorrhage that is a grade 2 to grade 3, so you still see some part of the retina. And in those situations, if you were able to see some part of it, I would think the current approach would still be doing PRP laser. The benefit of doing PRP laser is that it takes a bit of time for the regressions of the proliferative changes to occur. Laser doesn't act very quickly, but anti-VEGF acts very quickly. So the fibrosis that occur following anti-VEGF treatment can be quite rapid. And some people even describe them as a crunch phenomenon or reactions. So in your assessment of the patients, you need to make a couple of observations. One is to make sure that there is not significant amount of fibrosis or tractions. If there is tractions already exist in addition to the vitreous hemorrhage, then I think you should look at early vitrectomy. It is still beneficial to apply the laser at the time of the preoperative period, because that will reduce your time for the surgery. That will reduce the chance of bleeding during the surgery. So I think in the patient you described, I would say start off with pan-retinal laser photocoagulations. Bring the patient back in a month. During that time, you will prescribe the patient be restful and sleep with the head elevated so that it encourages vitreous hemorrhage to clear. When the patient comes back, if the vitreous is clear, then you can do more PRP. You can add now anti-VEGF, which you can see. I think personally it's dangerous to add anti-VEGF without good visualizations of the fundus. And then if the vitreous hemorrhage does not clear after a month, then I think if it's a type 1 diabetic patient, then you should do surgery, you should wait more, because they tend to have much more aggressive course. If it's a type 2, it's an adult onset one, and if the visions start to improve, the vitreous hemorrhage has some improvement, then you can wait. If not, I think you won't go wrong by start discussion with the patients for the options of vitrectomy. So I will use anti-VEGF cautiously in cases when there is difficult related to the fundus. I don't think the management of proliferative diabetic retinopathy has changed very much from the last 10, 15 years, even with the anti-VEGF. Because I don't think I don't think any of us will jump to use anti-VEGF for the purpose of managing proliferative diabetic retinopathy. I think most of us will still manage it for the using either laser, in the more advanced cases using vitrectomy. I think there are risks and benefits of anti-VEGF. The risks are that it can cause more tractions. The difficulty is costly treatment, and the difficulty with anti-VEGF also is that it is a repeated treatment. And when you stop giving anti-VEGF, the proliferations will return. So it's not very lasting. So with photocoag is something that patients still getting treatment for a period of 2 years, and up to like 9 to 14 injections. So I think the majority, like in cases like in Vietnam here or in Bangkok, or even in Canada, it will not be possible to do. This is too costly. I think laser treatment still, despite the protocol as result seem promising, is not a replacement for PRP. So I just want to make sure that this comes across, because the first impression when people look at protocol as they say, yes, we should start injecting anti-VEGF, say that no, it should not be. You should look at the patient and make that decision. Only we know that for sure the anti-VEGF will help to moderate, slow down the progressions, but it doesn't really be the answer. This is not lasting. I didn't go into any discussions about the technique for vitrectomy, because that will be discussed later on by Dr. Dorothy Wong on the for the vitrectomy for diabetic retinopathy. So I'm just limiting on discussion of medical management and the approaches for people with diabetic retinopathy. Thank you.